I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're looking at something, an oldie but a goodie?
Literally an oldie.
Literally an oldie.
The name literally means old or old master.
So we're looking at Laozi, a passage from Laozi, which
Dao
is...
De Jing.
Yeah, so his,
also sort of titled, if you're in a bookstore, you'll sometimes see it translated Dao De Jing.
Yeah, that we won't get into the difference between the Dao De Jing and the Dao De Jing, but that's just that's not a different Chinese. There's no difference in the Chinese.
No.
It's just a different romanization system. So the Dao De Jing is probably the most famous, most translated Chinese text in the West. Almost all of those people who translate it have absolutely no clue what's going on. Now, we should be fair. Most people who know a lot about Chinese and kind of classical Chinese philosophy don't know what's going on in the Dao De Jing.
And we'll get into a little bit of why it's such a peculiar text.
Enigmatic, really.
It's enigmatic, and it's fascinating because a lot of what's enigmatic is the language itself, because it's, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, but I think one of the things that I really feel most people miss when they read this is the sense of humor. There's a definite through line of sort of a cackling laugh in the background for both Laozi and Zhuangzi in this whole tradition.
The first line of this collection is Dao ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao, and that could be translated as the Dao which is Daoed is not the Dao, or it could also be the Dao which is spoken is not the
real Dao. Yeah,
right. And there are actually like a handful of other ways to translate it. So it's playing with language.
I mean, the first line, in other words, is a pun, basically.
And it's incredibly profound or a pun. You can't really
or
tell.
Possibly both. But this is one of the things that I think a lot of scholars, or just a lot of people reading it, mistake, is they try to read it primarily or only as this deep, profound, guiding philosophical text. And the problem is that it's just so full of puns and asides and just weird circumventions that the idea of this being some sort of unified guide for life is just frankly kind of silly.
And it's not quite as funny as the Zhuangzi, which is a text
very few things are
bring up in line with this. So the Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi are both supposedly coming out of this quote unquote, I've got my air quotes here for the listener who can't see me.
Right.
The Daoist quote unquote tradition that may or may not be helpful in how we think about these things, but they are both definitely related. There's a kind of concern in both of them about stability of language, of concepts, of reality itself. Is reality actually real? And to situate this a little bit historically, to start with the legend first. According to legend, Laozi is called Laozi because when he was born with a full head of white hair and a beard, snow white hair. So he looked like an old man when he was born, hence the name Laozi. The other part of the legend is that he never intended to write anything. He just sort of wandered around like any good teacher in antiquity did in the Warring States period. Like Rob and I did.
While we were in China, that's what I did. I just wandered teaching from place to place.
It's just like Samuel Jackson's character in Pulp Fiction. We just wandered the earth like
Came
Laozi.
from Kung Fu. That's us. That's exactly how it was. But apparently, I forget who. He was pressured into doing it. Someone just said, this is amazing. Why don't you write it down?
So these are all legends that are kind of floating around. What probably happened is these are a collection of wisdom pieces from village headmasters who just kind of wrote them down. Someone collected them, maybe had some curatorial bias towards these kinds of Taoist thinkings, but yeah, we don't really know that much. This Laozi supposedly is the earliest of the major Chinese philosophers.
And by major, we mean it's a little like the pre-Socratic tradition in Greece, where there are philosophers who exist well before Plato and Aristotle, but Plato and Aristotle are sort of the
ones who are preserved.
These are the guys. These are the canonical ones. These are the ones you always go back to. And
so I guess Laozi would be Socrates here?
It's kind of hard to peg down. Of those two, I'd say Laozi would be closer to Plato, simply because...
In terms of chronology or in terms of content?
Style, I would say. Okay. But so anyway, the Dao De Jing is a very short text. When you're talking about the single work that represents either a tradition or the person writing it, It's a very short work. I mean, considering how important this is, it's around 5,000 Chinese characters, which is really not much. I think an average newspaper has more than that.
Yeah.
And so it's very terse. It's very concise. It's very playful. There's no guiding argument that runs all the way through it. There's no sort of principle you can look at that unites the whole work.
It's almost an anthology, really.
It kind of reads that way.
Which is probably what it is.
Yeah. There are other writers I've read in the Western tradition who have something like this. Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil sort of has. Wittgenstein is a little bit this way, the German philosopher who just has sort of like
blue and brown notebooks.
Yeah,
maybe.
And the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which is a wonderfully snotty title for an academic work. But anyway, that's just a collection of
says
thoughts,
wonderfully
too.
and snottily.
I know. It's my prerogative. Like Bobby Brown sang about.
This is what happens when you get a PhD in literature.
That's
you
it.
can throw those things around.
Even things you think are not snotty are snotty. So
yes.
So let's go back to the work. So the passage that you and I are talking about is, I think, one of the strangest, because I don't know if you can really understand it. It gets formulated into more formal philosophy quite a bit later by the Huainanzi, which we've done a podcast on also. The short passage, and it really is very, very short. I'm only going to read the translation, and there's a couple of different ways to translate it. And so the first way is essentially the Tao, according to the Tao, by doing nothing, nothing is left undone. Or you could read it as the Tao causes all things to be done while doing nothing. And so the two Chinese characters Wu Wei. Wu literally sort of means nothing or a lack of something, and Wei has a lot of different meanings.
But to do.
Kind of to do or to be or to become.
And Wu Wei is very important when we're talking about Daoism.
Yeah.
It's the concept of doing nothing, or the not doingness.
Yeah. Passivity maybe is a good way to think about it. But see, this is why it's such a peculiar concept, right? You know, how far do you take this idea of doing nothing?
Right. I mean, for me, passivity connotes not doing something, but Wu Wei, one of the ways to interpret it is the doing of not doing things, right? Like it's an active not doing.
The active pursuit of not doing anything, yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, the ongoing debate throughout Chinese culture, and then of course later on, once we start having translations of this European and American culture as well, does he mean literally like just sit on a bench and do literally nothing and all the problems of the world will get worked out? When you read the rest of the Dao De Jing, one of the things that Laozi is getting at is that there's an order to things. There's an already established order that precedes anything human beings do. And so when you
That's called the Tao.
That's called the Tao. It's not just nature. Nature also has its way. It's Tao, right? And by acting precipitously in any fashion, you run the risk of overturning something, setting something else out of whack, and making it, lose its Tao, lose its way. So what the sage is supposed to do, the great person is supposed to do, is understand how things are working and seek how to not change them, not affect them.
Which sometimes is a very active process of not doing things.
Right. It's in a lot of ways, when you think about it, just physically, that's the way a lot of modern science works. You have to just sit and watch and then make observations and then sit some more.
And there's a Zhuangzi parable about Butcher Ting that we should probably do at some point that really nails this principle on the head.
But it still becomes problematic because of the tradition that's rising alongside of this from Confucius, which is, if anything, pretty much the exact reverse, which is if you want society to work correctly, there's like a system of protocols and rules that everyone needs to adhere to, or else things are going to go off the rails, right? Now, you could maybe make the case that is an attempt to define what society's Tao, society's way is, but Laozi is a little more concerned about not just how do you make human society work, but how do you ensure that what human beings do is going to fit in with the way, the larger way, the cosmic sort of way things are.
And I don't think we've pointed this out yet. We're looking at the 37th chapter of the Dao De Jing. And one thing that's interesting about the 37th chapter is it's a very short piece, only maybe not even 100 characters, I would say. But it connects this principle of Wu Wei to leadership, and particularly rulership. So it says when the leader adopts this Wu Wei principle, then everything under heaven falls in its place and works. Implied, of course, is that if you don't, it doesn't work. Then things like interfering in these principles and inserting yourself, actively doing things to try and change things, as opposed to observing the Tao and figuring out which way things are supposed to go and just kind of like moving it in the right direction, almost acting. You can either act like a kind of try and resist the flow of the water, or you can try and guide it with an oar.
But you still would have to know how the water's flowing, where it's flowing, what the current's like, that sort of thing. And one of the critiques leveled against this, for lack of a better phrase, school of thought, is that it's just not practical. It's not something that leaders can ever use, which is in large part what the 2nd century BC text, the Huainanzi, is attempting to do, is attempting to put this into conversation with Confucius, with legalism,
to figure out how it becomes a philosophy of rulership.
Yeah, this is how you can use it to actually govern things. But, for a good 2 or 3 centuries, or longer even, this is just not a practical ideology. In fact, if you talk to people today in China,
they still feel like it's really impractical.
It's really fascinating, but it's really not. It's not practical. You can't actually use it, which in a way is perhaps a lasting testament to how interesting these concepts are. Because, that's what Laozi was saying. Was no, you can't just take this thing, run out, and change the world. If that's your goal, you're missing the point, right? You first need to pull back and see how things are already working, and if anything needs to be done at all. And so one of the ways to understand this do nothing idea is that it's kind of like an ideal. If everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, then nothing has to be done, right? That's the Tao. If everyone is following the correct way, you don't have to do anything.
It's very much if I could compare it with American political thought, it's very much a libertarian vision of governance, in that there are these systems that are self-fulfilling. I think that would be a term that F.A. Hayek would use. You don't need government to make money happen. You don't need government to make language happen. They just happen on their own. The problem comes when this external force interferes.
Right. And of course, the more pragmatic person would say there's always an external force.
And I think government does have something to do with money.
I agree.
Money, at least. Maybe not language.
Oh,
but
sure.
I guess the French would say that government creates language.
Maybe. Right. But one of the things, though, that I would bring into this discussion, and it's the only reason I thought about it is I was reading some Nietzsche the other day, because I'm a nerd, in Beyond Good and Evil. And one of the things that Nietzsche brings to the table in the 19th century is to confront philosophy with natural science, and to say, listen, if the only thing you're doing is simply saying what you're thinking, you're missing a whole lot of bodily sensations and naturally occurring instincts that have just as much to do with what you're thinking as the sort of cognitive process you call thinking. And Laozi's doing something similar. Confucius is dealing largely with sort of social rules. How do you get ahead? How do you ensure that things are working correct? Sort of the gears of society. Laozi is looking outside the city walls a bit and saying, well, but how you lead has just as much to do with a river or a flock of birds or the rain as it does classes of people inside the city walls.
Laozi is very suspicious, I would say, of human institutions.
Yes.
Just like a libertarian.
Right, and I'm sympathetic in some ways to both ideas, simply because it is not hard to look at the way human history works and go, yeah, people are missing the boat.
On the other hand, I'm sympathetic to a lot of my Chinese and Taiwanese friends who say, yeah, but I don't know if that's really going to work.
Right. And I think there's a reason why this never really became the dominant text.
Well, it's easy to see how Confucianism became the dominant text for the government, that the government was pushing.
Sure. And it's funny because you can chart a lot of how Chinese thought has developed simply by what it's made of Confucius or Laozi in different eras. The film they released a decade or so ago in China on Confucius, just Kongzi, was every bit the teacher as
a
pillar of the
communist.
state, like the person whose goal is to make sure that the government is able to officiate well, and everyone should be a good patriot and support the leadership and stuff like that.
It's very similar, actually, disturbingly,
Yes.
to Lei Feng's diary.
It is very similar, actually, to his diary. And again, where is Laozi in this discussion? And you started off
Where
by
is
saying,
his film?
Where's his film? I would love that film. Guy gets born with white hair and a beard. I mean, it would be an amazing film. It'd be like Pan's Labyrinth. But you started off by saying this may not have been written by an actual person, but simply a collection of texts.
And you can sort of see how
and you
this
can
would
see
be an
kind of how
adage,
it
a
feels like an
series of
anthology.
adages.
Yeah, it does. And that could have something to do with why it ever became a dominant text. If you have this is almost the kind of philosophy you'd expect from the kinds of people Mao would tell us much, much later were the pillars of the revolution, the farmers, the soldiers, the workers, like that, right? A farmer would go, yeah, that's great, the laws that you have, that's hooray for that, but you can't actually control rain, and that's what we need now. I think one of my final thoughts would be, for me, the importance of the Dao De Jing in terms of understanding Chinese culture is as much why it wasn't adopted as any kind of official doctrine or propounded as something that's supposed to guide society. There are a lot of very good reasons why, but understanding why pretty much every dynasty from then on did not adopt it as their official teaching is instructive.
Yeah. I've heard that Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unite all of China, used Laozi some, but really it's not a very good kind of consolidating rulership text.
What it requires of you is to wait and watch and listen, and that's not something you're going to do if you're trying to start a dynasty.
And I think that's actually a good place to end it. Rob and I are going to try and start our own dynasty right now.
We're going to sit in the podcasting room and do nothing so that all the problems of the world can be solved.
That's right. Rob's incredibly good at that.
I'm very good at that.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.